Thank you so much, Diane. Well, as our final two panels, we have a fascinating series of conversations for you today to wrap up not only this conference, but to give us an overview of what are the final days of COP. We'll begin with a perspective looking at the private perspective of what's happened so far and where we're going, and then the public perspective on the same questions. And joining me on stage, I'm very pleased to welcome Feike Sijbesma, who is the CEO of Royal DSM, and John Danilovich, the Secretary General of the International Chamber of Commerce. Feike, let me start with you. One of the really interesting things, and the reason why we asked you to join us today, is Royal DSM is a very interesting company. It started as a state... You think so too? It started as a state-owned mining company. It then transitioned to a chemicals company, and then went fully privatized, and under you has transitioned from a chemicals company to a life sciences company. And so you sort of uniquely have an opportunity to tell us about what it is like to transition a company, which of course many firms, hopefully in the post-COP world, will go through a similar transition. But before I do, since we're talking, before I ask you about that, let me ask you, both you and John are private players. You don't represent a government. So what exactly are you guys doing at COP21? Why are you here today?
It's a good question. And there were moments in the last 1.5 weeks I was asking that question myself also. But I'm with a very specific goal here. And of course the mandate here at the COP21 is with governments. And why could we eventually not come to a good agreement? I don't think so. I hope we come to a very good agreement. But if we don't come to a good agreement, what is the argument of governments not to push further? The only argument I hear has to do with economy, jobs, competitiveness, and those kind of things. That is our territory also. I know about the economy, I know about jobs, I know about competitiveness. And what I tried to do in the last year with several of my colleagues is making a statement with 43 CEOs in April, and now recently, last week, with 80 CEOs. They say, hey guys and ladies, to the governmental negotiators, go further, make a stronger deal, put a price on carbon, take a step further. We from business say this is possible, no, even stronger, this is needed. And hopefully what I'm doing, I don't want to make the negotiators' life difficult, but I would like to take one argument a little bit out of their hands, and that is the argument of the economy, the jobs, etc. If we as business leaders say we can go one step further, then I hope that governments feel stimulated, facilitated, helped to go this one step further. And that is the reason why I'm here, and I think that's the reason why business leaders are here. And I found that very, very important.
So let me push a little bit on that, because we heard something similar from John Kerry this morning that was arguing that one of the strongest arguments for an agreement out of this COP21 is an economics argument, that this will benefit industry. And yet, with the exception of many of the people here who are in Paris today and many people on this stage, we know that if we were to speak to many companies, we would hear something very different. We would hear perhaps a different argument than the one that you're making, which is fossil fuels are incredibly inexpensive. We have an entire infrastructure and economy built around the exploitation of fossil fuels. At one time, Royal DSM was a company that made its living by taking fossil fuels out of the ground. What are those CEOs getting wrong? What do they not see that you do that has not brought them fully on board as enthusiastically about the economic imperative behind an agreement?
Every transition from A to B is difficult. Every transition and every change, you have people in an organization or in a country or in the world who do not see the point B we need to reach, and who see only difficulties moving from A to B. And moving from A to B, whatever it is difficult. And moving from A to B gives winners and losers. And those who do not adapt will be the losers in a movement from A to B. So you get always resistance, you get always issues. But the new climate economy report showed if we wait longer, the burden for next generation, the financial burden, will only be stronger. The report showed clearly, and there's so much evidence, we can address climate change whilst having economic growth. And the more we wait, by the way, the more that similarity maybe does not apply. So I hope that the people who are fighting against will stop fighting against, will stop lobbying against the measures for addressing climate change, and will see that they need to change also from A to B. And that's difficult. That's difficult always for people.
John, let me ask, as the Secretary General of the International Chamber of Commerce, you not only advocate on behalf of businesses, you try and persuade your members and businesses to get on board with things that they might push back a little bit. When you're making this argument to CEOs who are not as fully on board as Feike, what argument are you finding are persuasive, and what arguments are you finding are less persuasive?
Sure. Thank you, Charles. The global business community is in a place now where it has never been before. Meaning 5 years ago, you would not have seen this engagement in Copenhagen, and you certainly wouldn't have seen it before in the previous incarnations of the COP process. Now at COP21 in Paris, I think you're seeing on a global basis business being fully engaged. The International Chamber of Commerce, as the World Business Organization, with 6.5 million members in 130 different countries throughout the world, has experienced in the last month, in the lead up to COP21, a mobilization and a groundswell of participation and involvement and commitment that hasn't been seen before. You mentioned, to take one end of the spectrum, fossil fuel companies. If you go to the ExxonMobil site, to the website, you'll see a very clear indication of their transition, not immediately, not tomorrow, but in due course, over time, transitioning from fossil fuels into alternative energies. You'll see the magnitude of their investment that they're making, that they have made in the last several years, that they are going to make this year and in the future, and of the general, leaving the fossil fuel community, commitment are companies that are very much engaged in this, that are here this week. DSM, of course, Novozymes, Siemens, Bayer, many other companies that are involved in this process are here and present and accounted for and participating in this process because they are, on a corporate level, committed to it.
So let me ask you this. Let's say we have an agreement this week out of Paris. Where do we go from here? What, a year from now, 3 years from now, before we get to the 5-year theoretical ratchet point, what do we see emerging out of companies in corporate America and global corporations that is different from right now? Because as you mentioned, a number of companies are already on the bandwagon, a number aren't. How is the world transformed from a corporate perspective in 3 years?
I'm not sure if Friday is the day, or in due course, Friday or Saturday, when the final text comes out, if that's actually going to be a tipping point in and of itself. It's going to be a landmark, it's going to be a demarcation point, but the process has already begun. The process is already occurring. It's a matter of continuing that process over the next years and up to the 5-year review period. Companies now have a level of transparency which is required in some cases by regulation. You have some unique cases and some exemplary cases, as in the state of California, where I happen to be from a number of the provinces in Canada, where there are now state-regulated commitments that companies have to make with regards to the ecological environment. But going forward, you're going to see companies in and of themselves as a responsible member of the international community and as responsibility to their shareholders, as the shareholders are demanding that they pay proper attention to these matters. And in terms of transparency, you're seeing increasing levels of transparency. So on a corporate level, you'll see it not only in the balance sheet, but in the corporate reports, what the efforts that are being made, and how those efforts are being, on an annual basis, not on a 5-year basis, but on an annual basis being reviewed. And in terms of reporting, shareholders, civil society, are now demanding that companies act in a responsible manner and hold their feet to the fire, if that's the right expression, in terms of performance and performing and delivering on these commitments.
Feike, what about DSM? So 3 years from now, is DSM, does what happens this week matter 3 years from now from DSM? Or are you on a path that whether there's an agreement or whether there's not an agreement, you stick with that path?
Well, we are on this pathway already for quite a while because I'm anticipating that the world needs to change. I mean, we need to change now from the fossil age we live in to the bio-renewable age we are entering. And in 150 years from now, when we live really in the bio-renewable age, hopefully in 100 years, hopefully in 50, hopefully in 25 years from now,
knock on wood,
hopefully faster. But whatever period it is, we will look back to this fossil age as a tiny little blink in history. We live only in this fossil age for 150 years when we started digging out coal, later on oil, later on gas out of the ground. And we made everything, energy, cooling, heating, transportation, materials dependent on 3 raw materials. Only 150 years ago. We did thousands of years without that. And we lived from natural resources. And only during 150 years, we went in this fossil age. We will change into this bio-renewable age and live again from sun, wind, land, as we did before, but in a much more innovative way, and there our company plays a role. I mean, we once left the Stone Age also, not because we were short of stones, and the stone traders said, Mamma mia, what is happening? There's still enough stones, we can stay in. No, there were better alternatives. And that is happening now also. There are better alternatives which can be cheaper. And what happens then, that our company sees this, we need to reduce, enable, and advocate. What do I mean with that? We need to reduce our own footprint. Every year we have agreed the first 25% greenhouse gas emission, now the second 25% greenhouse gas emission reduction, energy efficiency 20% up, 50% of the electricity getting out of renewables, those kind of things. Reduce your own footprint, one. Secondly, enable. Develop products which enable all the people, all the companies in your value chain to be more sustainable. We increasingly live from sustainability. That's rather odd for a company which started as a coal mining company 115 years ago, but we abandoned that in the 60s, and we abandoned in the last 10 years bulk chemicals, moving to a life science and material science company. And we enable now the whole supply chain by making coatings for solar panels, by making second generation biofuels using agricultural waste which is being burned today, by reducing the weight of cars, taking toxic chemicals out of electronics, those kind of things. So reduce and enable. And the third thing, what I'm doing right now, is advocating. Advocate for a change in society. Put a price on carbon. Saying to the politicians, you can do that. Oh, really? And some people are criticizing, said, well, that would influence companies, that would maybe influence your profit. Yeah, if you don't adjust, it will influence your profit. If you do adjust, maybe you can even benefit from that. There is a great future. There's not only a future which we all look with our head down and this terrible future without fossil resources. No, there is a great future to be created. And listen, it is clear for everybody that in 2050, 2060, we will live, if we don't act now, in a world between 4 and 8 degrees Celsius. Even the oil companies are saying that. That world looks terrible. That world has huge amounts of climate refugees. We cannot deal with the refugees today. Now, we ain't see
we'll be swimming
yet.
to the conference rather than...
Exactly. So we need to adjust.
So let me ask you something, though. The transition from the Stone Age to the non-Stone Age, the transition from pre-industrial to a fossil fuel-based economy, neither of those were legislated, right? Those were natural outgrowths of technological innovation. Those were natural outgrowths of finding new resources and exploiting them. What we're talking about here is a little bit different because we're talking about not a completely economic transformation that's motivated by economics, but rather one that is equally motivated by legislation, by policymakers. In the next panel, we're going to have Jerry Brown on stage, Ernest Moniz, Angel Gurria from OECD. So these are people who run the pillars of government, and they are the ones who, as much as business, are going to be driving that shift in an economic basis. What do you need to see from government to make that transition seamless and smooth and something that you run into as opposed to something that's forced on your colleagues?
You know, I think Jerry Brown, as I've mentioned previously from the state of California, really has created what can be termed an eco-government. His comprehensive approach to the environment in general, water, wind, land, soil, as well as productivity, as well as a corporate approach, is so all-encompassing that it's acknowledged as an international model, as I've also mentioned, as is the case in several Canadian provinces. So in terms of eco-government, we see that in terms of legislation, in terms of regulations. We're seeing that in a regional way, which is, I think, quite inspirational. It's often difficult for national governments to get their act together on a federative basis, simply because countries are so large and so diverse and have different constituencies. But then you have an example like California, which, if it were a country, would be whatever it is, the fourth or fifth most.
I think the seventh largest economy in the world, right?
Seventh GDP in the world, not something that can be slightly ignored, who is already in the forefront of this process. So you have a process, as has been mentioned, which is already happening. So COP21 is a continuation of that, but it is at a landmark in the sense that you now have commitments from governments on a national level, which perhaps have not been so energized as they were previously. I think the fact that you have President Xi in the United States 2 months ago meeting with President Obama, both of them issuing statements which were really quite far-reaching. It's a matter of delivering on those commitments. We've all seen the news reports out of Beijing and the reports on the Indian cities, et cetera, with regards to pollution. It's now a matter of these countries to do their best efforts for President Modi, for President Xi to move, Prime Minister Xi to move ahead on these things, to deliver on their commitments.
And I want to talk for a moment about how we measure whether companies are living up to their commitments. But let me ask really quickly, Feike, you mentioned number 2 was enable, right? We still do see some technological gaps between the price of fossil fuels and the price of renewables because we don't have the technology to take advantage of renewables quite as much as we hopefully someday will.
Wrong.
You don't believe so?
Wrong.
You think that fossils are cheaper only because of the subsidies? You think the technology is there? Do we need R&D support from governments to get there?
Can you make cars cheaper without seat belts, without airbags, without cage protection, etc.? Can you jeopardize with safety in the world and make things cheaper? Yes. Can you jeopardize the world with polluting and make things cheaper? Yes. But everything we have has a price, also based on conventions. And what we did not realize and did not do here is we have 500 billion fossil subsidies. If we take that away, the whole fossil industry looks slightly different. If we add to that the price of pollution, which not next generations, but the children of the people in this room are going to pay, then I think that a lot of alternative technologies are already competitive today. And
does it
if
work
I
without
look to
carbon
the
pricing?
development of the technologies, I think there's much more to come.
What about without carbon pricing, right? Because in the United States, charging carbon pricing is very controversial. It's unlikely we're going to see it unless we see some type of massive change in our political system. Without carbon pricing, do we still see the same economic argument that you're making right now?
Well, I said fossil subsidies, first of all, take that away. A price on carbon, add that. That makes already the technologies competitive today. Now, both we have. We stimulate fossils and we don't price on the environmental pollution. Even then, solar is becoming soon a more competitive technology. Even then, some forms of biofuels will be more competitive. So those kind of things are already in reach in not too far distance. Now, if I add to that the other two things, the subsidies on fossil and the lacking price on carbon, I mean, we can rapidly transition. And what I expect of governments, and that is their role here, is that they take measures to create a facilitating environment in which those technologies develop themselves a little bit faster, and not they develop themselves a little bit slower. Because otherwise, the next generation, people of the children of the people in the room right now, are going to pay the damage. Many people ask me, will the next generation die due to climate change? I don't think so. They don't die. They will solve the problem. But they will spend all of their fortune to resolve the problems. They will cope with refugees, etc. So it will not be a nice place. And they will discuss in 2050. Did those people in 2015 really had no clue? And we say, no, we had a clue. We had conferences with thousands of people, and we discussed it. No, we had a clue. And then we'll say, oh, since they had a clue, by the way, why were they lacking? Well, change is difficult, and we had opponents against, and people pro, and people didn't want to change, and it's all difficult. Do you understand?
The
and
nice
there
thing,
might be people who say in 2000, no, I don't understand.
no matter what happens, as we all know, our children and grandchildren will be completely ungrateful for anything that we get done today. Let me open it up to some questions, because I know that there's quite a few in the audience. Yes, sir.
Mr. Danilovich, I'm wondering if there's much awareness among your companies about the carbon pricing new mechanism, the platform, the International Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition, which was just formed, which aims to get every country to have a price on carbon within 5 years?
Certainly there is. And we fully acknowledge that carbon pricing, decarbonization is part of this whole process. So our company's commitment at various levels is part of that process. So it's one of the tools, one of the mechanisms that can be used going forward with regarding to confronting the climate challenge, along with many others, along with innovation policies, along with massive investment with green bonds and things of that nature. So carbon pricing, along with a package of other activities, is something which the corporate world, the global corporate world, will be looking at in now and going forward, both.
To add to that, it will be important. We use internally a price on carbon to anticipate already on a future, to drive already investments today, to create already awareness internally. It will be interesting for financial institutions to also work with a so-called theoretical price on carbon till the moment there is a real price on carbon, in order to see how vulnerable their investments are. And I bet some financial institutions are doing very vulnerable investments already today. And that is not really transparent for the people whose money that is.
I think that's absolutely right.
Going hand in hand with the comment with regards to that type of innovation on your part, I'm sure you probably heard Michael Bloomberg and Mike Carney speaking earlier last week and again this week with regards to the creation of a task force which will assist companies in transparency in terms of reporting, in terms of accurately representing where they are on this spectrum, which ties into the whole investment prospect as well. So you need companies that can adequately and accurately report their performance so as to avail themselves of the financing that will be available to them if they are doing the right things internally. And your advanced, your sort of ahead of the curve proposition internally at DSM, I think is terrific.
Let's take another question. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, how do you operate in a political sphere where some companies are actively working to slow clean tech policy and the policies y'all would like to see? And how do you oppose or coordinate with those companies to create the environment that will get us to the point B you mentioned earlier?
Our constituency is broad. You can imagine with 6.5 million companies, corporations, associations, we represent just about every viewpoint you could possibly have. And there are those that are aggressively green, if I can put it that way, and those that are somewhat less aggressively committed because of their balance sheet, because of their profitability, because of their traditional industries and their the challenges which they face internally in terms of this transition. Almost without exception, however, companies acknowledge that there is a problem, they acknowledge that something has to be done about it, and they acknowledge that they have to be part of the solution. How they address that is tailored for each corporation. As I've said, some are aggressive, some are less so, some have other constituencies which they have to deal with, but it's undeniable that the problem exists, it has to be solved, corporations realize they're part of that process, businesses are absolutely present in terms of dealing with this. Their degree of commitment varies from company to company.
Let me ask Feike that same question, because unlike John, who is aligned with many, many companies. Sometimes we're talking about your partners, sometimes we're talking about your competitors. How do you use carrots and sticks with companies that you're competing against or partnering with, but have perhaps less suasion with than the ICC or governments?
Well, I hope that governance will help us to set the right framework for transition. But in companies, I mean, many big companies have MBAs, people having Harvard degrees and all.
Not that there's anything wrong with Harvard MBAs, as someone who has
okay.
one, yeah.
And no, that's what I mean. Smart people, and smart people who can think strategically. And still, I see so many companies moving from one quarter to the other quarter and not thinking about the long term. We had a huge internal debate in our company some decades ago about can we remain a fossil-based coal mining company or not. And at the end of the day, in the 60s, the chemical people in our company won the debate, said coal mining will be abandoned. And it was abandoned, and we stopped with it, and we entirely stopped in the only thing we were good at in the 60s. in coal mining. And we became a chemical company. And I said, when I came in the company in the late 90s, and the beginning of the decade, of the millennium, 2000, will we remain a bulk chemical company? No, we will change. And that change, all those changes do not go from one day to another day. And there were people internally in the company, and the old directors were complaining and said, well, don't move so fast. The world will not move so fast. I mean, at a certain moment in the 60s, the argument was used in the Netherlands. DSM will always remain with coal mining. At that moment, 40% of the Netherlands was dependent on our company on using coal. And the rationale was, the Netherlands will not disappear, the Netherlands is dependent on coal mining, so DSM will always remain in coal mining, a nice circle. And we still said it's not true. And we still said also, the last 10 years, we will not remain as a bulk chemical company, we will change ourselves. Now the problem you get, and you have that in governments also now, a whole society, that the people who are leading were developed in the old paradigmas. They were good in coal mining, or they were good in bulk chemicals, or they were good in the fossil age, and they became the leaders. And they need to change themselves, which is not easy, or need to be replaced to a next generation who can make that change. But I don't want to replace everybody, but I hope that people can also that change, that reinvention by themselves, and that need some courage, like losing weight, I know what I'm talking about, or other things. It needs some courage to change your lifestyle or to change your mindset. And this is what is on the agenda. Because we cannot be successful, nor call ourselves successful in a world that fails, and that we need to realize.
Let me thank our panelists so much for this conversation. We really appreciate it. And
Thank you, Charles.
we hope to see you soon after a great agreement.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Charles.
Thank you so
Very
much. Really appreciate it.